The courtroom was silent, but the air was thick with tension. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against me, waiting, watching. Judge Reynolds, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, adjusted her glasses and looked down at me from the bench. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her gaze felt off. I had been in courtrooms my whole career. I had faced opposition, challenges, even hostility. But this was different. I straightened my shoulders and stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, "I appreciate the opportunity to be here today." A small smirk tugged at the corner of Judge Reynolds' mouth. "Do you?" she asked, tilting her head. The way she said it sent a ripple of unease down my spine. The words weren't meant as a question, but as something else. A warning. A challenge. I ignored the feeling. I had come here for one reason, to stand for what was right. This case mattered. It wasn't just about legal arguments. It was about something bigger. Something that could change everything. But before I could continue, Judge Reynolds let out a sharp sigh and leaned forward. "Ms. Bondi," she said, "I must say your presence here is interesting." A few quiet chuckles spread through the room. I glanced toward the opposing counsel's table. They weren't laughing, but there was a glint of something in their eyes, approval, satisfaction. They knew something. Something I didn't. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was scanning every detail, every shift in posture. Something was off. I just didn't know what yet. As I was saying, I continued, keeping my voice measured. This case is about fairness and the integrity of our legal system. Judge Reynolds didn't move. She simply stared, and then she laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. But it was there. "Ms. Bondi," she said, shaking her head, "I have to admit, I find it amusing that you, of all people, would speak about integrity in this court." A murmur spread through the gallery. My stomach tightened. This wasn't normal. Judges didn't do this. Not in open court, not on record. This was something else. Something personal. I set my jaw. "Your Honor, I'm here to discuss the facts of this case." "Are you?" she interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Or are you here to put on a show?" The words cut through the air like a blade. A hush fell over the room. I could feel the shift, the moment where the tone of the proceedings turned from formal to something dangerous. My pulse quickened, but I refused to look away. I had faced tough judges before. I had stood my ground against fierce opposition. But this wasn't about the case. This was about me. The silence stretched between us, a battle of wills playing out in front of everyone. I could hear the ticking of the courtroom clock, each second dragging longer than the last. Finally I spoke. "Your Honor, if you have a concern about my presence here, I'd be happy to address it. But I would hope we can keep this focused on the matter at hand." Judge Reynolds studied me for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Then, slowly, she leaned back in her chair. "Of course, Miss Bondi," she said, her voice smooth. "Let's stick to the matter at hand. For now." There it was again. That tone. That hint of something beneath the surface. I wasn't sure what game she was playing, but I knew one thing. I had just stepped onto a battlefield I hadn't expected. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. A strange quiet settled over the courtroom, the kind that made every little sound feel louder than it should. The shuffle of papers, the faint creak of a chair, the distant hum of an air vent somewhere above us. I kept my eyes locked on Judge Reynolds, watching, waiting. Something wasn't right. She still had that smirk on her face, the one that didn't quite match the moment, as if she already knew how this was going to play out. But I wasn't about to back down. I had been in tough rooms before. I had faced pressure, ridicule, even threats. This was different, but the feeling in my gut was the same. "Miss Bondi," Judge Reynolds finally said, drawing out my name like she was testing the way it sounded in her mouth. "I have to say I expected something more." The words hung in the air, twisting into something heavier than they should have been. I narrowed my eyes slightly, but I didn't speak. "Not yet. I expected facts," she continued, folding her hands together. "I expected legal arguments. Instead, what I see in front of me is—" She let her voice trail off, as if the end of her sentence wasn't worth saying out loud. I clenched my teeth. "Your Honor, But she didn't let me finish. Frankly, Your presence here is an insult to this court. Gasps filled the room. I felt the shift immediately. It wasn't just a comment. It was something more. A jab meant to cut deep, to rattle me. I had dealt with opposition before, but not like this. Not from the bench. For a split second, I caught movement in the gallery. A few exchange glances. A whisper between two reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. Everyone had heard it. Everyone had seen the shift in power. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Your Honor, I came here today in good faith, prepared to discuss the facts of this case. Is that so? She asked, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. She leaned forward just slightly. Because it looks to me like you came here for a different reason entirely. A chill spread through me. I had seen plenty of legal tactics in my time, but this was something else. This wasn't just about this case anymore. This was about me. I straightened my shoulders. If there's a specific issue with my arguments, I'd be happy to address them, I said, keeping my voice calm. Otherwise, I'd appreciate the opportunity to continue. Judge Reynolds tilted her head, as if she was sizing me up like a witness on the stand. Then, just as quickly, she let out a small laugh. Oh, Miss Bondi, she said, shaking her head. You really don't see it, do you? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. I could feel the energy shifting, moving, like something bigger was happening beneath the surface. The problem was, I still didn't know what it was. But I was about to find out. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. I could hear the shuffle of papers, the creak of the judge's chair, the faint tapping of a pen against a desk somewhere behind me. But above all, I could hear the silence, thick, waiting, expectant. The kind of silence that only comes before something big. Judge Reynolds had that same smirk, the one that sent a ripple of unease through my chest. She wasn't done yet. I could feel it. I tightened my grip on the edge of the table. Your Honor, if there's a concern about my conduct, I'd appreciate the chance to address it directly. She raised an eyebrow. Oh, I think you'll have that chance soon enough. I didn't like the way she said it. Too certain. Too rehearsed. Like this moment had been planned long before I ever stepped into this courtroom. I glanced at my legal team. Mark, my lead attorney, had his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. But I knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders. He felt it too. Judge Reynolds tapped a finger against her desk. Miss Bondi, I have reason to believe that you have been interfering in this case unlawfully. A hush fell over the courtroom. A second stretched, then another. I barely breathed. I let the words settle, let them echo in my mind. Interfering. Unlawfully. It didn't make sense. It wasn't true. But she said it like it was a fact, like she had proof. I forced my voice to stay calm. That's a serious accusation, Your Honor. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, I'd like to see it. She gave me a slow, measured look. Oh, you will. A door creaked open in the back of the courtroom. I turned slightly, just enough to see two uniformed officers stepping inside. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't about the case. It wasn't about legal arguments or justice. It was about control. About power. I inhaled slowly, steadying my heartbeat. I wasn't going to let her rattle me. Not like this. Miss Bondi, she continued, her voice smooth and deliberate, you are now under investigation for obstruction of justice. A murmur spread through the gallery. I felt the weight of a dozen stares pressing against me. My name was being written down, whispered between reporters, etched into the air like a scar that wouldn't fade. I lifted my chin. That's a false accusation. Judge Reynolds just smiled. We'll see. The two officers took another step forward. The room had never felt so cold. And in that moment, I understood this wasn't just an attack. It was a message. And I wasn't sure how far they were willing to take it. The moment the officers stepped forward, the air in the courtroom shifted. The quiet murmur that had filled the room seconds earlier was gone. Now there was only tension, thick and heavy, pressing against me from all sides. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched as they closed the distance between us, their footsteps slow but deliberate. The lead officer, a man with short-cropped hair and a rigid posture, stopped just a few feet away. His expression was unreadable, but his hand hovered near his belt. The other officer stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, waiting. I forced myself to breathe evenly. On what grounds? My voice was steady, but inside, my mind was already racing. Judge Reynolds didn't even hesitate. Contempt of court, she said smoothly, like she had been waiting for this moment. Obstruction of justice. You can take your pick. A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. I caught a glimpse of Mark, my attorney, rising to his feet at the defense table. His jaw was clenched, his hands flat on the wood, but he stayed silent for now. He knew this wasn't the moment to speak. I shook my head slowly. This is an abuse of power, Your Honor. Judge Reynolds tilted her head, almost like she was amused. Is that so? She let the words hang for a beat before turning to the officers. Proceed. The lead officer took another step forward. Ms. Bondi, he said, his voice formal, practiced. Please turn around. I didn't move. My pulse pounded, but I refused to show it. You know this isn't right, I said, my gaze locked on his. You know this is political. He hesitated. Just for a second. Judge Reynolds let out a small sigh. Oh, for goodness sake, she muttered. Do your job, officer. And just like that, the moment was gone. The officer reached for my wrist. His grip was firm but not rough. I didn't resist. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But as he turned me around, as the cold metal of the handcuffs locked around my wrists, something inside me burned. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about the law. This was about silencing me. Behind me, Mark finally found his voice. This is unconstitutional. His words were sharp, cutting through the thick air. There is no legal basis for this arrest. Judge Reynolds didn't even look at him. Sit down, counselor, or you'll be next. A chill ran down my spine. The officers started to lead me away, their hands firm on my arms. I glanced at the gallery, at the faces staring back at me. Some looked outraged. Others looked afraid. And a few looked satisfied. I kept my head high as they walked me past the rows of seats, past the cameras, past the reporters who were already scribbling notes. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. They thought they could break me. They had no idea what was coming next. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists as the officers guided me down the courthouse hallway. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. The doors ahead led to the holding cells, a place I never imagined I'd be. Not like this. Not for doing my job. The officers said nothing. They didn't have to. The damage had already been done. Cameras had flashed. Reporters had scribbled notes furiously as I was taken away. The headlines were probably already being written. But that wasn't what was bothering me. Something about this felt too smooth, too rehearsed. Judge Reynolds hadn't just taken a shot at me, she had set a trap. And I had walked straight into it. One of the officers stopped at a metal door and pushed it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room with nothing but a bench against the wall and a camera in the corner. A holding cell. Temporary, but humiliating all the same. They guided me inside. The door clanked shut behind me. I took a slow breath, rolling my shoulders back. This wasn't where I belonged. And I sure wasn't planning on staying. Minutes passed. Then more. The silence settled in, pressing against me. But I wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. A familiar rhythm. I looked up as Mark, my attorney, appeared on the other side of the bars. His tie was loose, his face tense. But something in his expression was off. I'm working on getting you out, he said, his voice low. I studied him carefully. That shouldn't take long, I replied, because there's no case here. Mark exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Pam, this isn't just about today. I frowned. What does that mean? He hesitated. A little too long. Something twisted in my gut. You knew, I said slowly, watching him. Didn't you? Mark didn't answer right away. That was enough of an answer. I stood up. You knew they were going to do this. His eyes flickered with something. Guilt. Maybe. Regret. I suspected, he admitted. But I didn't know it would go this far. A slow wave of anger built inside me. Not just anger, betrayal. Why didn't you warn me? My voice was steady, but I could feel it shaking underneath. Mark sighed. Because I thought I could stop it before it happened. I was wrong. I turned away for a second, forcing myself to breathe. I had trusted him. He was my attorney, my ally. And yet, here I was, sitting in a holding cell while the people who wanted me silenced were out there celebrating. I turned back to him. How deep does this go? Mark hesitated again. But this time, when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Deeper than you think. I clenched my fists, the handcuffs digging in again. This wasn't just an attack. This was war. The walls of the holding cell felt closer now, like they were pressing in with every second that passed. I sat on the cold bench, my hands still cuffed, my mind racing. This wasn't just about me. This was about something bigger, something deeper. And Mark had known more than he let on. Footsteps again. Sharp, quick. Someone in a hurry. I looked up just as the door swung open. A different officer this time. Younger, maybe mid-30s, a tight jaw, a badge that caught the dim light of the room. He looked at me, then back at Mark. She's being released, the officer said, unlocking the cell door. Mark exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. But I didn't move. Not yet. Why? I asked. The officer hesitated, his eyes flickering to Mark, then back to me. Order from the DA's office. Someone pulled some strings. That didn't sit right. The DA? Why now? Why not before? I stood, the handcuffs clicking open. My wrists were red from the metal digging in, but I barely felt it. There were more important things to focus on. Mark stepped closer. Let's go, he said under his breath. Before they changed their minds. I walked out, the officer leading us down the hall, past courtroom doors that were still full of people whispering, watching. I could feel their eyes on me. But I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't humiliated. I was ready. The second we stepped outside, the cold air hit my face. But so did the flashing cameras. Reporters swarmed. Shouts filled the space. Pam, do you have a statement? Why were you arrested? Was this politically motivated? I stopped. Just for a second. This was what they wanted, wasn't it? For me to be dragged out, thrown in a cell, silenced. Humiliated. I wasn't giving them that. I lifted my chin, looking straight at the cameras. This was an abuse of power, I said, my voice strong. And I will not be intimidated. A frenzy of questions followed, but I didn't answer any more. Not yet. I turned to Mark as we pushed through the crowd. I need to know everything, I said. He nodded. Then we need to move fast. I didn't like the way he said it. Like there was more coming. Like the fight had only just begun. And deep down I knew he was right. They had tried to take me down. Now it was my turn. The weight of what had just happened was still fresh as I sat across from Mark in a quiet office, away from the noise, away from the flashing cameras. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Mark had barely spoken since we left the courthouse, and I knew why. He was still measuring his words, still deciding how much to tell me. I wasn't in the mood for caution. Start talking, I said, leaning forward. Who pulled the strings to get me out? Mark hesitated. A judge overruled Reynolds' order. Someone higher up saw what was happening and didn't want the mess that would follow. That doesn't answer my question. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. There are people watching this case. Some of them want you gone. Some of them don't. The DA's office didn't want the bad optics of you sitting in a cell, so they made a call. But that doesn't mean they're on your side. I clenched my jaw. So I was just a pawn in their game. That's exactly what you were, he admitted. And it's exactly what they think you still are. I shook my head. They're wrong. Mark met my eyes. Then we need to make a move before they do. He pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. I flipped it open. Inside were documents, emails, transcripts, pieces of something bigger. Something deeper than just Judge Reynolds' personal grudge against me. This isn't just about today, Mark said. It's about control. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it. I scanned the pages. There were names I recognized. People who had worked behind the scenes to make sure this case went a certain way. People who had known about my arrest before it even happened. This is what they were trying to hide, I muttered. Mark nodded. And now you have the power to expose them. The realization settled in. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they could silence me. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated me. I closed the folder and stood up. Then let's turn the tables. Mark didn't hesitate. Where do we start? I met his gaze. We go public. He nodded. Then we need to move fast. because the people who wanted me gone weren't going to stop. But neither was I. The city lights blurred through the tinted windows of the car as we drove downtown. I sat in the back seat, flipping through the documents Mark had given me. Every page, every email, every note was another crack in the foundation Judge Reynolds and her allies had built. They thought they were untouchable, that no one could stop them. They were wrong. Mark sat beside me, checking his phone. "The press is waiting," he said. "You're sure about this?" I met his gaze. They wanted me to be afraid. They wanted me to back down. But I won't. He nodded. "Then let's make sure they regret coming after you." The car slowed as we neared the courthouse. Cameras flashed outside. Reporters lined the steps, waiting. They had followed every second of my arrest. They had written their stories, speculated, taken sides. Now they would hear the truth. I stepped out of the car, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the podium set up outside the courthouse steps. The murmurs quieted as I reached the microphone. I let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. Less than 24 hours ago, I was arrested in this courthouse. My voice was strong, steady. Not because I broke the law, but because I stood up to those who abuse it. The cameras flashed. I could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation. Judge Reynolds wanted to silence me. The people behind her wanted to make an example out of me. But they had made one critical mistake. They had left a paper trail. I held up the folder in my hand. These documents expose a coordinated effort to manipulate our justice system. Emails, transcripts, meetings. Proof that my arrest wasn't about the law. It was about power. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The reporters scribbled furiously. Mark stood beside me, unreadable, but I could feel his approval. We had them. I continued. I was arrested in a courtroom for doing my job. But those responsible, those who conspired to make it happen, will not walk away without consequences. A voice called out from the crowd. "Who are you accusing?" I didn't hesitate. Judge Reynolds, for abusing her position on the bench. Certain officials within the DA's office, for weaponizing the legal system against political opponents. And others. I paused, glancing at Mark, who gave a subtle nod. Who will be held accountable soon enough. More gasps. More murmurs. The storm had begun. But I wasn't finished. I will not be intimidated. I will not be silenced. And I will not stop until every person involved in this corruption faces justice. The crowd erupted. Questions flew at me, reporters shouting over each other. But I didn't need to answer any of them. The truth was out. The tables had turned. And Judge Reynolds wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.